have them happen the way you would like. So with that, we're done.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning. Yeah, please. Plus. I'm going to talk slowly as people come in because they need to hear what I'm going to say. I very much appreciate the invitation to be here today. If I were immodest, I would say this is probably the most important talk of the next couple days. But I won't say that. But it is important, and it's important because of two questions that I'm going to ask now, and I'll ask again at the end of the presentation. If not now, when? And if not you, who? And although Harriet painted a really good picture of the support that especially the facilities have within BES, me and then my colleague Michael Lubell from APS, who's going to talk for about 5 minutes after I do, are going to sort of send a word of warning about the outreach and the communication that we continually need to do. But I'm going to stay very positive today. I think there's a lot of opportunity to make a lot of progress in D.C. in the area of science and educating people about science. But first, I want to do a couple of things. One, I'm going to go through a quick primer about some of the terms that you might hear if you go to Washington and you talk to members of Congress or you talk to their staff, or you just read some of the things that are printed in the newspapers. So I'm going to speed through this, and this will be made available to you if you want to go back and look at it later. But basically, the big thing you need to remember in Congress about issues you're concerned about is there's two types of committees. There are authorization committees. Authorization committees pass laws that regard or set up programs, set up policy, but don't necessarily fund it. They'll say what the top limit of funding is, but they won't provide the actual funding. An example of that is the American Competes Act, which when it was first authorized or first passed several years ago, it instituted a lot of the things that came out in the Gathering Storm Report. It was updated in 2010 with new funding levels, but it doesn't mean much if you don't have the appropriations. So the Appropriations Committees are committees like the Energy and Water Appropriations Committee in the Senate. The Authorizing Committee in the Senate for our facilities would be the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. In the House, you have the House Science Committee, Subcommittee on Energy and the Environment. And in the House, you also have the Appropriations Committee, too. So introduced legislation is considered by committees of jurisdiction. So certain committees have responsibility for their area of jurisdiction. What do committees do? They hold hearings. And this is what you may think a hearing looked like. This is a Watergate hearing. It was packed. They turned hundreds and thousands of people away. This is a typical hearing. Okay. And this is a NASA hearing, not to pick on NASA. Usually NASA hearings are actually more populated than this. But this is more what it's like. But still, they do hold hearings, and the reason they do is because they need a congressional record. They need to at least make it look like they've done their due diligence. Actually, they do, and a lot of staffers work really hard to put good hearings together so that they can identify the real issues to be interested in and work on. So another term, so hearings, you've heard of that. You may not have heard of the word markup. So all committees, appropriations and authorizing committees, mark up. This is the Bill of Rights, and this is a real copy that's at the Library of Congress. It was marked up. People put their pens and pencils and marked it up. This is actually an amendment that Energy and Water Appropriations member Alan Nunley from Mississippi offered back in May when the House Subcommittee on Energy and Water Appropriations considered the bill. Again, they marked it up. It was adopted by a voice vote, and it was Nunley Amendment number 1. So another term that you may not have heard or have heard, not know what it means, is reporting out. So here's Norm Dix, ranking Democrat, House Appropriations, Harold Rogers, the chairman of Appropriations. They're shaking hands. They've agreed on a bill. They've passed it out of committee. The gavel strikes, and it's done. Next, of course, you have floor action. We all know what that is. Conference committee in absolutely the prettiest rooms in the world. This is where some of the conference committee meetings are held. Presidential action. Okay, this one, signing up. This is yeah, thank you. And then or they can veto it, right? So that's basically that. Also wanted to show you this. This is appropriations process. The big point about this is it begins way before a bill actually gets passed. When they finally pass an appropriation bill, it's gone through a long, long progress. Harriet talked about some of the working groups, BSAC and other groups that study issues. DOE decides what to do. They put it into a budget. They send it to OMB. OMB sends it to Congress. Congress debates on it, and they finally pass it. It's a long process. So that's just a quick primer. So what's happening now? Thankfully, Harriet covered most of that, so I'm not going to repeat what's happening now. But just two major things to remember. They did pass a continuing resolution that the President signed. It goes through March the 27th. It was a good thing that they passed it. And I think both parties and both houses of Congress realized it was the right thing to do, thankfully. Of course, the Budget Control Act of last year set up this wonderful process, set up a committee that was supposed to identify spending cuts. That didn't work. So sequestration may occur, and if it does occur, Office of Science, 8.2% reduction on January 3rd of next year. That would be tough. So what's next? Depends on the election, depends on the election, depends on the election. And it's a fool's game to try to predict what's going to happen. There's so many scenarios out there that if afterwards over coffee or a cocktail, I'd be happy to talk about those and dream with you about what might happen. But right now it's impossible to figure it out. All right, so this is gets to the nut of the presentation. Everyone does support science. If you ask any member of Congress, they support science. Oh, yes, I support science. Absolutely. Science is really important. It drives innovation. But it's very, 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 very thin. It's not, there's no depth at all. There's very few members of Congress who actually understand what science is really about, understand how it works, understand the peer review process, understand how it's translated into commercial activity, understands how it drives our education, how it drives, how it excites young people and gets them into good careers. They have no depth in it. So, again, the question, if not now, when? And if not you, who? You are the best ambassador of your research. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, in my experience, I've taken many scientists to Capitol Hill in Washington, and a lot of them will go really well, and it's a great experience. Some of them, it goes not really well. So it's just a matter of communication and trying to get across the message with an audience that's unfamiliar. So we're going to go through a couple of things here. We call it education and outreach with impact. Anybody can communicate, but if you really want to move the ball or get people supportive or deepen that level of understanding that scientists have, that members of Congress and their staff have, you really need to think about what you're doing. One-on-one meetings with members and key staff are critical. And here's a picture of a beautiful group of very handsome people from Berkeley and LBL meeting with Congressman Chaka Fattah. He's on the Energy and Water Appropriations Committee, and he's from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is a bad example because he's really supportive and does have some depth of understanding. But we were there to talk to him about some new science and educate him more about what the importance is. If you're going to talk to a member of Congress or their staff, talk about something of interest or importance to their district. And that can be, it's not as necessarily as obvious or as easy to figure it out, but it's very, very critical. Here's an example of Congressman Alan Nunley. He's the one who offered the amendment in the Appropriations Committee hearing that I noted earlier. His district is northwest Mississippi and has a small town called Olive Branch. Within Olive Branch, a company from Santa Clara called Solidigm just built a manufacturing facility that at peak will employ around 300 people. I think they're up to 90 or something right now. The technology that was developed there or the technology that Solidigm is going to be utilizing was actually, a lot of it was developed here at Berkeley Lab. And some of the future work that Solidigm is doing, they're actually doing work on new materials for new, even newer, better, more super windows, testing it at the ALS. So when we go to Alan Nunley's office, Solidigm goes there first, or we go with them, or we make sure he knows the impact. And it's a great story because you can tell the story from basic science all the way to jobs in his district. Sometimes it's not that easy. Sometimes the work is not esoteric to you, but it will sound esoteric to other people. There's other ways to make connections to the district or to the person. It may be a postdoc you have from that district. It may be a graduate student you have or multiple graduate students. It may be that they have a particular problem in that district. They may suffer from too much phosphorus in the water, and there may be some research that you're conducting that may have some impact on the knowledge that would help that district. The problem with that is you have to do the research, and you have to engage your government affairs people at your institutions to help you do that. Also, another way to get to a member of Congress is pick an issue that's close to their heart, that they're interested in, that they want to learn more about. They may want to they may have a goal of establishing themselves as a leader in that area of science or that policy area. I won't mention if it's Republican or Democrat, but I think you probably can figure it out from some of these. Some offices will be clean energy, some will be fossil energy, right? Enhanced oil recovery. And you're smart enough to figure it out. If you're not smart enough to figure it out, ask your government affairs people. Healthcare, a big one, and all the light sources, especially, all of them basically are doing a lot of work in this area. And then environmental remediation. Environmental remediation can be very interesting to people in both parties because they have issues in their backyard. So really think about how to connect with that member of the staff. If you don't, you're going to get this. Either they're going nuts, they don't understand it, they're bored, or they're dreaming, okay? And unfortunately, most staffers, here's a picture of a caucus of staffers talking about the sequestration issue. They're really, really, really young. Staffers are very, very young, and that can work two ways. One, that you can go in and they think they know it all when they actually are only 24 years old and they don't know it all. But it also works the other way, and I find it works this way most of the time. They're very excited. And if you can connect with them and connect with them in a way that helps them and helps their boss, you may find some who actually start to bother you, right, because they want more and more information. Now, that said, there's a caveat. If you do go to the Hill, and I encourage you all to go to the Hill, even the person who's most scared of going to the Hill, if you practice and prepare, you'll do a good job. A lot of people will stare at you with blank faces. Bells start ringing for votes. They get distracted. You never hear from them again. Those sorts of things do happen. But a lot of the time, you'll see a spark in their eyes, and you'll be able to tell a good story. Practice makes perfect. I just said this. Practice. If you are going to go to the Hill, or if you're going to have a member of Congress or a staffer in your laboratory or at your university or whatever, practice, practice, practice. Don't assume because you've given 1,000 papers in front of scientific audiences that you can just say, oh, I can do a 2-minute. I can do that. Practice in front of a non-scientist or, a non-scientist. Practice in front of a lawyer and a lawyer or a banker and give their feedback because you are going to say words that they don't understand, and the member of Congress typically won't understand it either. Have fun. If you can't have fun and be passionate about your work, who can? Again, if not you, who? You've got to show passion. You can't go to the Hill thinking, oh, they're going to cut my funding. You better fund me. You have to go with, wow, this is amazing science, and let them figure out that they would be dumb not to fund this, right? Too many people go to the Hill thinking you aren't smart enough to recognize that you need to fund me or my science or my lab or my institution. That's the wrong approach. You have to get them excited about science. Basic. Thank you notes, of course. Thank you notes or other follow-through. Do it instantly, immediately. Okay, ongoing joint efforts. Just to finish up, a couple of examples of what we're doing, what I'm doing with some of my colleagues from other national laboratories and from universities around the country. But before I say it, it's great that BES does have a lot of support, especially among the sophisticated, educated staffers of the committees that fund, that do the actual work for writing the bills. Unfortunately, in D.C., in Washington, as Harriet's graph that showed how many days after the end of the fiscal year they actually get their work done, as that demonstrates, it's different times we live in. It seems to get worse and worse. It seems to get crazier and crazier. In those kind of instances where omnibus bills are passed and continuing resolutions with exceptions are extended, those decisions, like H.R. 1 back in FY 2011 or prior to FY 2011, those decisions were made at a much higher level of leadership. The leadership in the House of the Republican Party, Boehner and Cantor and McCarthy and those guys, and then the Democrats in the Senate. And often, in those sort of situations, science gets squeezed out because of that thinness. It really takes a back seat to a lot of other issues and to a lot of alligator-wearing, cigar-smoking, very expensive lobbyists, to be quite honest, who have much more access. That's why it's important for you to go as a constituent. We need to make it difficult for members of Congress to ignore science. So some ongoing efforts. NUFO. How many here have heard of NUFO, National User Facility Organization? Okay, wow, fewer than I thought. There is a National User Facility Organization that represents you guys, and I'd recommend going to the website. It's nufo.org, and look and see what they've got. They have an annual exhibition in D.C. every year. You can go. When I go, not every group does this, but when we go, I take a group of scientists and users. There's a few people y'all may recognize, and some may be here, actually. But we actually go and meet with members of Congress and their staff. We don't just go to the exhibition. We go and we tell them why national facilities are important. A big initiative we're doing right now is with AAUs, with AAU, the American Association of Universities, and the National Laboratories. We're putting together a program with a few key members of Congress, a few university presidents, national laboratory directors in industry, and we're going to talk about the nation's ecosystem of science. It's not just national labs, it's not just universities, it's not just industry, it's an ecosystem. And that's something that people really don't get. Some members of Congress, if they vote for NSF, they think they voted for science, and they're done. Or if their issue is NIH, they voted for NIH, they're done. We have to educate them. And then we work with trade organizations and industry groups. Here, the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, along with Anna Eshoo, Congresswoman from Silicon Valley, Zoe Lofgren, Congresswoman from the Silicon Valley area, Persis Drell from SLAC, and Paul Alessados from Berkeley Lab. We had a joint event on light sources for the Silicon Valley Group leadership, the Silicon Valley Leadership Group membership. It's a couple weeks ago. Great event. We had a lot of big industry there. So we do that sort of thing as much as we can. So finally, I'm not going to talk about this, but in my presentation, which you can find, here are some tools that you can use. This is not exhaustive. Right? There's many, many more things you could do besides this. But there's some things that you can do or that can be done to reach out to your members of Congress. That's all I had. And now I'd like to introduce from APS, someone who's familiar to everyone here, I'm sure, Michael Lubell.
Thanks, Don.
Sure.
See, I think you can all hear me.
Oh.
Wait, you want me to take this?
Sure, sorry.
All right. spoke to you about the importance of communicating with Congress. Harriet mentioned some of the difficulties that we're facing financially in the coming years. And what I want to get across to you is some information that comes from polling that a number of organizations did about a year and a half ago. And the reason I want to tell you about this, I'm going to do it very fast, I'm not using any slides, so you just have to listen. The reason I want to tell you is that the landscape really has changed. Communicating with members of Congress and their staff and getting their attention is great when budgets can go up and may be adequate to do it that way. And that's typically what we have done. For most of the period of the last 15 years, budgets have gone up somewhat, not necessarily as much as we want. We're facing a period where that is unlikely to happen. And what this means is that members of Congress are going to pay very, very close attention to what their constituents want, because every budget that gets cut is going to harm someone. So what do we know about public attitudes towards science? And this is based upon focus groups that we did and then a major national poll of 1,400 people, broken up politically into 4 constituency groups: Democratic primary voters, Republican primary voters, swing voters, and self-identified Tea Party people. The polling was not conducted by us. It was done by 2 very, very prominent polling firms: Republican firm, Public Opinion Strategies, and a Democratic firm, Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner. Here, I'm just going to give you the encapsulated version. Number 1, overwhelmingly, 90% of the American public believes that the United States should be a global leader in science. Half the people say the government does a lousy job. Now, this is not a condemnation of what the government does in science alone. This reflects a low point in public trust in government overall. So people are always there, ready to criticize. Number 2, positive. 75% of the respondents, including a majority of the Tea Party people, consider spending taxpayer money on science a valid government activity. You don't have to change people's minds about whether the government should do it or shouldn't. Now, here's the bad news. Half the people believe that we spend too much money on science. Cut the budget. Why? They don't think it's effective. They think too much frivolous science is funded, and they do not see impacts beyond medicine, disease. They do think that there's some relationship with energy, but they don't know what it is. Beyond that, nothing. In fact, when people were asked to identify from a long laundry list of government activities, what's the number 1 area that the government should cut? For Democrats, it was defense. For everybody else, it was science. For Democrats, science was number 2. Because they don't see the relevance of what we do to their lives. That is clear. We got that in the focus groups very, very succinctly from almost anybody of the people who participated. They just don't see it. So this is a huge challenge for us. We have tended to communicate with members of Congress. We have tended to tell people why science is a good career, why scientific research is exciting. We have not done a very effective job in telling people how their lives have benefited from what we do. And we're going to have to do this. So I'm just going to tell you that we started after the polling results. We sat down with Neil deGrasse Tyson, whom I think many of you know. And Neil said he believed that we had to get a round table together of some wonderful communicators, people in science, people in the media, and so forth. We did that on June 4th in New York. And on the basis of that, we have developed the outlines of a strategic plan that will take us going forward a number of years. Some key components: teaching scientists how to communicate, because most of us don't do a good job. And Don mentioned, you got to be able to practice, but you also have to develop the skills. And there's a center at Stony Brook run by Liz Bass, and this is Alan Alda's brainchild. Many of you may know who Alan Alda is. He's a wonderful guy, actor, really interested in science, and they are going around the country running workshops to teach people how to communicate. So communication is number one. Second thing is advertising. The American people respond to ads. Most advertising doesn't deal with what science has delivered, even though companies certainly benefit from that. We know that people like science, so we're going to be working with some advertising firms to basically who have clients to say, look, incorporate this in this. We also want to do some direct advertising in movie theaters. We want to involve the entertainment industry. We want to involve the sports industry, because this is where the average American gets information. I hate to say it, it's not from us. It's really coming from, the average American does not watch the Discovery Channel or the History Channel or PBS. They watch ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, MSNBC. This is where people spend their time. And we don't interact with those folks. That's another component. This is serious. This is a serious gap in what we've done. And I'm as guilty of this as anybody else. I haven't spent much time thinking about the public. I've been thinking about the Hill. Can't do that. Because if we focus only on the Hill and we ignore the constituents, we're not going to get the kind of support that we need, not just for science, but for the country. So I urge you to at least, we'll be sending out communications on this. I urge you, I know SLAC, for example, is going to be holding a workshop on communication at the end of October, October 24, 25, 26. And I think, this is something that we've got to take seriously. So I think I've used up my time, and I'll stop if there are any questions. I'm happy to answer them.
Quick question for Don or Mike as we transition.
Do you all hear that? The question is, how does one pay for advertising campaigns? And this, tell you what we're thinking. Number one, high-tech companies advertise. The only time, to the best of my knowledge, that any high-tech company took advantage of the popular support for science, which is thin, but it's there, was when GM, I think it was about 6-7 years ago, there was a new model of Cadillac that came out, and they had a tagline on that said, physics at work. So what we would like to see is high-tech companies basically say, scientific research, engineering research at work, something like that, so the public begins to understand that those products like the iPhone or the iPad, this was not invented by Steve Jobs. This came, instead, we did on the Hill, we did 2 sessions deconstructing the iPad to show what was actually inside that. Huge hit for congressional staffers. They didn't know. So that's one thing. The second thing is we would like to get the help of the entertainment industry. We're thinking of doing things in movie theaters. Turns out today's entertainment industry, Hollywood, is highly dependent on technology. In fact, there's a new documentary on this that just came out. And so we're going to be working with Hollywood, we're hoping, we've got some contacts there, to try to get their assistance in promoting this because it's for their own benefit. And then we need people with deep pockets.
I think we need to move on at this point, but I believe Mike's going to be around the rest of the day, and Don's here at LBL, and